Well, that was some intro, huh? The third and final game in Namco's Shiny Kart trilogy is one of the most infamous Famicom exclusives. People remember it for taking Star Wars and just doing whatever they wanted with it. It vaguely follows the plot of the first movie, in the sense that it starts on Tatooine, ends with a Death Star trench run, and has a bunch of characters you're familiar with. But everything else, totally different. When we get to the main menu, you're given the option to play as a Novice or Pro. The primary difference between the two of them is that on Pro, enemies will shoot at you. That said, Star Wars is nearly impossible to beat. It's one of the most difficult Famicom games out there. And even on Novice, you're going to have a pretty difficult time playing this one. After we get our opening cutscene, Luke gets his hair dyed black and then we start playing. You start out with the lightsaber as your weapon, and there's some real problems with it. It has a pretty short range, enemies are only hit if they directly touch it. That means that small enemies have a bad tendency to move around the blade. And worst of all, enemies that take multiple hits to defeat don't get knocked back or become unable to hurt you after taking the blow. That makes bosses have a bad tendency to get hit by the saber and then keep going forward to kill you. Any contact with the enemy is fatal in Star Wars, and that's a significant part of what makes the game so difficult. However, there is a way that you can mitigate the difficulty. Every enemy that you defeat drops one of these crystals, and those give you force points. The small one is 1 point, the big one is 5 points. Collect enough points, and you can press start, and that will give you a menu of abilities to use. The cheapest is the movement speed increase. I'd only use that in areas where you have to use it. Then a time stop, which freezes all the enemies in place. The next power-up makes beams shoot out of your lightsaber. That one is extremely handy for dealing with enemies, though it doesn't affect bosses. The lightning bolt is a blast that defeats all enemies on the screen. The bubble makes you invincible for a few seconds. The wing allows you to fly for quite a while. It's absolutely required to complete some levels. And the final one teleports you back to the beginning of the stage. It's there just in case you've gotten stuck. There's one more use for force points. If you have 40 of them when you get a game over, then you can continue. Though to continue, you do have to enter a code. Hold up and press A 8 times. Due to the difficulty of the game, it's going to make you want to avoid spending those force points just so that you'll be able to continue. While you're running around, you might find these bubbles. Those are extra lives. And this bubble lets you trade out your lightsaber for a blaster. That seems backwards to other Star Wars media, but the blaster is a much better weapon than the lightsaber. As you go through each stage, you'll eventually come across Darth Vader, and when you hit him once, he'll turn into a monster that you have to fight. Your goal on every stage is to rescue one of the team members. and you need them for later stages. There will be different points where you can't continue unless you talk to your team member. And you do that by hitting Start and selecting them from the Allies section. After you complete a platforming stage, you'll take off in the Millennium Falcon, fly off to the next planet, but before you land you'll have to shoot down a bunch of TIE fighters. And just like you, the Millennium Falcon can only take one hit. You do have a shield you can throw up 3 times, though I found it difficult to use. Instead what I did was whenever a TIE fighter was getting close, I'd swing in the opposite direction so that their shot would go off screen. The platforming in this game is a bit floaty. You have a lot of air control, but you also have a lot of momentum when you jump. There's a lot of platforming that requires precision, jumping onto these tiny bricks and platforms. It is harder than it looks. Naturally, the final stage is the trench run, and it takes the form of vertically scrolling shoot 'em up, with a constantly ticking down timer. You can control your forward speed a bit in this section, but if you're going to make it to that thermal exhaust port, you have to collect these T's which freeze the timer. If time runs out, the Death Star destroys Yavin 4, and it's game over with no continue. Obviously, Star Wars is extremely difficult. There is one thing you can do if you want to see the end of the game, though. There's a level skip code. You just have to press up and down at the same time on the control pad, then press start. If you're not playing in an emulator, you can do this by plugging in a controller to the expansion port, pressing up on it, and pressing down on the Player 1 controller. And if you think that's how I collected all the footage for this, yeah, of course it was. Are you crazy? I've never managed to get past the first trip to the Death Star. This isn't going to be the only Star Wars game that we see on the Famicom. At the very end of the Famicom's lifespan, Namco has lost the license, but Victor Music has gained it, and they released their Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back games on the Famicom. Those are the same Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back games that were released in the US as well. I know I've been talking about how difficult the game is, but it's also important to point out that Star Wars is a really well-made game. It looks nice, sounds nice, and even though the controls aren't perfect, it's still decent to play. It is, however, a game where nearly everyone winds up giving up in frustration, at least if they're not playing it with the benefit of save states. Because Star Wars is one of the most relentlessly cruel Famicom games. You are going to die a lot to things that you have no control over. And using the tools that they give you to mitigate that, make it very likely for you to have to start the whole thing over again when you get a game over. I still say to give Star Wars a try, just be aware of what you're getting into.